Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 220 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Well, this week, everyone is talking about the new documentary and new book saying that there is new evidence about the fate of the princes in the Tower, that is, the heirs to Edward IV who disappeared from the Tower of London, leading to, or at least paving the way for Richard III to continue to be king once he was on that throne. Now, before I get started into this episode, I just want to say that I have absolutely no skin in this game. It doesn't matter to me whether Richard killed the princes in the Tower or whether they survived. I'm always just looking to see what's new in history and what does it mean. And I just enjoy the fact that there's always new evidence that we can look at and make decisions about. But today, what I wanted to talk to you about is several different episodes in English history in which you have people who are disappearing or supposedly dying, and yet they have a particularly rich afterlife, at least in the rumor mill, with things that we can or maybe can't prove. So I just thought it would be interesting to look at a couple other royal mysteries where you have deaths and pretenders and have a look at these together and see what interesting patterns fall out. So today we're going to be looking at disappearing royals and their mysterious afterlives, coming up right after this. So before we start, again, I just want to say that I have no skin in this game. I'm just interested in history. So I'll tell you what I think about these royals, their disappearances, and their afterlives. But I'm never actually putting down other historians because these are people that put in a whole bunch of time and effort and enthusiasm to help push the field forward. And so I think anyone who is that enthusiastic deserves some props. So I'm not personally attacking anybody who is putting in any research into history. I'm always looking to find out what I think is the most plausible explanation. So I just want to put that out there because I think that the discussion about the princes in the Tower has become kind of nasty. If you're looking on social media, especially, people really dig their heels into a position and they seem to think that you have to put down the other side in order to put your side forward. And I think that that's not necessary. We'll just look at the evidence together and we'll just see what we have to say. So today, it's just going to be about some interesting stories, and then I'll get to what I think about Richard III at the end of the episode. So I think if we're going to talk about disappearing English royals and their deaths, I think that we need to start with Arthur Plantagenet. So if you are interested in finding out the whole list of English kings, I did an episode on that a while back, so you can go and have a listen to that if you want to see all the kings in order and what they're known for. But Arthur Plantagenet never made it to the throne. And this is something I actually mentioned in Chivalry and Courtesy, that people kept naming Princess Arthur, but they never actually made it to the throne. There's never been a legit King Arthur. If you believe that there was a legit King Arthur in the quote-unquote Dark Ages, there hasn't been one since recorded history. And so people just stopped naming the Princess Arthur because it seemed to be almost a curse. They always died before they got to adulthood. So coming back to Arthur Plantagenet, I've just given you a preview about what's going to happen. We're in the time of Henry II's family. So Henry II, if you remember, he had a whole bunch of kids with Eleanor of Aquitaine. And the youngest of these was John. And John was one of these people that never expected to be king in a million years. He had a whole bunch of brothers in front of him. William, who died in infancy, Henry the young king, who died of illness, Geoffrey, who died at a tournament, and then Richard, who died of gangrene. And it seems almost like Shakespeare's Macbeth when you look at John's history, because here he was, never expecting to own anything. He was never given any power or land by his dad, which is why he was called John Lackland at the time. And so it must have been a really weird experience to be John and to see your brothers drop off and lead to the throne. So John was still never meant to be king as long as there were other boys who were in the line before him, meaning if Henry the young king had a son, if Geoffrey had a son, if Richard had a son, those were going to be in the line for the kingship before John. And this did indeed happen. We know that Richard the Lionheart never had any kids, famously, but Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, did have a son named Arthur. Now, what we need to remember, and again, I'm going to throw you back to another podcast episode I did with Christine Morgan about Melusine, who was a mysterious demon figure, maybe a two-tailed mermaid, we don't really know. But she is meant to have been, or said to have been, one of the relatives of King John and all the other brothers in this household. They are said to be the devil's brood because apparently they are descended from Melusine. And I'm mentioning this because these Plantagenets were thought to have had a huge temper, like just massive temper tantrums where they'd be foaming at the mouth, just red-faced, the type of temper tantrum that people remarked on because it was so frightening and immature in a lot of ways. So John was a member of the devil's brood, and here he is watching all of the people who are heirs to the throne dying before him, leaving a path open to the throne, which is only stopped by, his path is only blocked by Arthur of Brittany, his nephew. So again, I think you can see where this is going. John was in a big fight with the French king, Philip of France. If you'll remember, Eleanor of Aquitaine had brought a lot of land to her marriage to John's dad, Henry II, and John just kept losing it and kept losing it. And he was in fights with his nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Eventually, he did capture Arthur, and that's when things went bad. It's remarkable that Arthur was not treated like a royal when he was in captivity. He should have been the next on the throne, but he wasn't. He was treated pretty badly by his uncle, King John. And then one day, it was just before Easter in 1203, John got rip-roaring drunk, the type of drunk that people were talking about when they called this the devil's brood. And on that night, Arthur of Brittany disappeared. Now, some people say that King John went and strangled Arthur with his own hands and dropped him in the river. A young boy's body, a teenager's body, was found by a fisherman and buried by nuns who were at a nearby convent to give him some dignity. But Arthur disappeared. This is the closest we have to a record of what happened. But of course, and you'll see this is something that is consistent with this type of disappearance, we just have sort of sources that might be kind of credible, but it's really hard to say when anybody is credible, especially because often we are getting documents that were written long afterwards or they're copies. Or often they're both. Either way, we know that Arthur of Brittany disappeared in Rouen around Easter of 1203, and nobody saw him after that. People started to think that he was murdered. They weren't sure. They wanted to find him. They couldn't find him. The King of France had an idea that Arthur was murdered because he started to say, John, we're not going to get peace until you show me Arthur. And John couldn't do that. So it's likely that Arthur of Brittany was killed by John's hand. We don't know. By John's order, maybe. But either way, he disappeared and people were sure that he was murdered. But they had rumors around that time that he was possibly alive and possibly murdered. So without seeing the body, nobody was sure. And this is something we're going to see again and again in history. Arthur of Brittany was a prince. He was a teenager. He threatened his uncle's rule and he disappeared. Next, we have Edward II. Edward II was the son of Edward I Longshanks, if you are a Braveheart fan, or even if you're not a Braveheart fan, he was called Edward Longshanks. Edward II is the great-grandson of King John, so we're still safely in the Plantagenet house. So Edward II, if you remember, he is the guy who had a lot of favorites. He was not super big into being king. Some people at the time said he would rather have dug ditches, but he was the king and he had favorites and he really, really spoiled these favorites. So if you've heard the names Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, these were two of Edward's favorites, both of whom lost their lives because of how Edward had just completely spoiled them. Edward was not a good king. No one remembers him as being a good king. He was deposed by his son, his teenage son, Edward III, who was backed by his own mother. So Edward II's wife, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, with the backing of Isabella's brother in France. So Edward II is deposed and he's imprisoned. And he's not imprisoned for very long before people start to try to bust him out of it. He was imprisoned, at first I believe he was imprisoned in Corfe, and then he was imprisoned in Berkeley or Berkeley Castle. On September 23rd in 1327, someone came to his son in the night and said, your father has died in prison at Berkeley Castle. He's died of natural causes. It seems important to remember that Edward is said to have died of natural causes. And I mention this because it's significant that this was the original cause of death and nobody made a fuss of this, because this is the guy who decades later was said to have been killed by a red-hot poker being inserted in his rectum. This is very unlikely to have happened. It's basically propaganda. Don't believe it. He probably either died of some sort of helped along natural causes, something like starvation, or he was very likely murdered, because a king that is still alive is a threat to the throne. What's interesting about this is that 3 years later, his brother Edmund was executed because he was part of a plot to free Edward II. So he believed that his brother was still alive and at that time being held in court. So Edmund, Earl of Kent, who was the brother of Edward II, tried to rescue his brother. The plot failed and he was executed. So remember, the Earl of Kent, this is going to be significant later in interesting ways. Now, the interesting thing about the story of Edward II is that years later, people said he didn't die of natural causes, that he was murdered. And this was actually said in front of Parliament that he was murdered. But what's really interesting is that there were rumors about Edward II's survival for many years afterwards, to the point at which somebody said that he was living in Italy, basically a religious life. He was just living incognito in Italy. And this was reported back to Edward III. And apparently, Edward III did meet him and spend time with this man for about 3 weeks. This is fascinating. It doesn't tell us anything about whether Edward II really did survive, whether this was really the guy or not, because it doesn't do Edward III, the current king, any good to confirm or deny this at all. So it's still a mystery. And if you're interested in this mystery, and actually quite a few other mysteries that involve deaths and pretenders, you can check out Ian Mortimer's book, which is called Medieval Intrigue, Decoding Royal Conspiracies. So I'm deliberately not using the word conspiracy today because I think that it's so loaded. But Ian Mortimer does go through some of these pretender situations in this book. And for the record, according to this book, unless he's changed his stance since he published it, Ian Mortimer believes that Edward II really did survive, that he really did escape, that he really did live the rest of his life incognito. Either way, for many years after Edward II was said to have been killed, told to the king that he died of natural causes, there are still rumors about Edward II still being alive and living his best life, perhaps, in Italy in a religious context. Then we move on to Richard II. Richard II is the great-grandson of Edward II. So again, we're skipping a few generations between these mysteries. But still, weirdness is happening. It's coming back around almost like clockwork. Richard II was the son of the Black Prince. He came to the throne as just a child, around 9 years old. And he was convinced of his divine power, which made him very heavy-handed. It made him tyrannical. He had a lot of favorites, just like Edward II. You would think that looking into this history would be useful to a new king, but it wasn't. Richard II was just not a great king. He did have a shining moment when he faced the peasants down in the Peasants' Revolt. That took a lot of bravery, even if he really came down on them afterwards. So he was a tyrannical guy. He was also deposed, like his great-grandfather, by a relative. He was deposed by the future Henry IV, who took over. He said he wasn't going to take over the throne. He just wanted his land back because he had been exiled and he'd been disinherited. But as it turned out, while he was there, he decided to take over England as well. So Richard II was forced to abdicate. And this is another Shakespeare play, which is really beautiful. I think if you haven't read Richard II, or if you haven't watched the one with Ben Whishaw, it's actually a really beautiful play and one that I quite like. So Richard abdicates. He is confined to Pontefract Castle. There was a rescue attempt made by his nephew. And what's really interesting about this, talking about history repeating, is his nephew was the Earl of Kent. So he was the descendant of Edmund, Earl of Kent, who was killed trying to rescue his brother, who had also been imprisoned after being forced to abdicate. So interestingly, there is a rising called the Epiphany Rising in January of 1400, where the Earl of Kent is one of several nobles who tries to rescue Richard II. Strangely, not strangely at all, Richard II dies shortly thereafter. He was probably starved to death by all accounts. He was dead by the middle of February in 1400. But maybe Henry IV had read some history and heard about Edward II possibly living his best life, possibly people not believing that he was actually dead. So Henry IV decides he's going to quash these rumors before they start. He shows Richard II's body around town, makes sure that the people can see it. His face is uncovered, and he's said to be emaciated. So Richard II was probably starved to death. And his usurper wanted to make sure nobody had any rumors that he would still be alive after this. Guess what? A few years later, people were saying that Richard II was still alive, and they followed a pretender who they probably knew was a pretender to dethrone Henry IV. So this is something that happens again and again. Even if you show the body, people might not believe it and they might follow a pretender. In the case of Richard II, it's pretty firmly a pretender, but it doesn't matter. He's a figurehead. This plot did not succeed, and eventually everything settled down because Henry IV died, and coming to the throne was Henry V, who everyone quite liked because he was pious, he was militaristic, he won a lot of battles in France. He actually got to the point where he was named the heir to France. So Henry V was somebody that nobody wanted to replace with a pretender, so it was no problem. Until he died and Henry VI came to the throne. Now, if you remember, if you listened to that episode before, Henry VI is one whose grandfather had mental illness. He was the King of France and believed he was glass. Henry VI had a mental illness as well, although we don't know for sure what it was. We do know that he became basically catatonic a few times during his reign, which left him vulnerable to being usurped. His throne was usurped by Edward IV, and this is the Wars of the Roses. So, when Edward IV came to the throne, he put Henry VI aside, but he didn't kill him. He just kept him in lush captivity. And this was a huge problem, to the point at which Edward IV was actually deposed, and Warwick the Kingmaker, if you remember his name, brought Henry VI back to the throne. Again, Edward IV was forced to flee the country until he could come and take it back. And when he came to take it back, he imprisoned Henry VI once again. But weirdly, Henry died almost immediately of natural causes. Surprise! You didn't see that coming, did you? So Henry VI is murdered. I think we can all reasonably conclude that that is the most likely case, that Henry VI was murdered. Perhaps he died spontaneously of natural causes, but it's extremely unlikely. Edward IV, having learned from history, decided to show the people the body of Henry VI to make sure that everyone knew that he was actually dead. And this sparked all sorts of interesting rumors around Henry VI that made him into a saint. Basically, people believed he was saintly. His corpse was said to have bled spontaneously to kind of demonstrate to the world that he was murdered. So no one really believed, even at the time, that Henry VI just died, just up and died spontaneously. So here we have Edward IV comfortably sitting on the English throne, and that is where the story of the princes in the Tower begins. So before we get into the princes in the Tower, it's important to remember that the king that is going to be Richard III is alive and participating in the Wars of the Roses. He is there for it. He knows what a pain it was to have Henry VI alive and wandering around while his brother was trying to keep his hold on the throne. So Richard knows what's going on and how difficult it is to hold your throne when there's an heir there. I think it's important to remember this in context, whether we think Richard III was a villain or not. So he's there for all of this. Some people will go so far as to say, especially in fiction, that Richard III was a participant in the murder of Henry VI. This is super unlikely, so I wouldn't say this is something that you should lend any credence to. But Richard is definitely part of the Wars of the Roses. He's supporting his brother, Edward IV, and he sees how hard it is to hold the throne when you have a legitimate person who has a right to it. So Edward IV, sitting on the throne, he has many kids. 2 of them are Edward and Richard. This is so confusing when you look at English history. So I'll try and keep it as straightforward as possible. Edward IV dies pretty suddenly of disease, and he leaves his sons as heirs to the throne. He asks his brother Richard, I'm calling him the third, he's not king at this point. He asks his brother Richard, the future third, to take care of his son Edward and make sure that he gets his throne, that he gets his power. That's not what happens. Edward IV dies thinking this is what's going to happen. There's going to be a peaceful transition of power to his son, who is Edward V. Edward V never actually becomes king. And it's because, one, he is declared to be illegitimate. So there are a whole bunch of people that are persuaded, or maybe believed genuinely, that Edward and Richard, the sons, the princes, were illegitimate because Edward IV, their dad, may have been married before he married Elizabeth Woodville. So there are people that are casting doubt, casting aspersions on the princes, saying that they're illegitimate. When they are declared to be illegitimate officially, it clears the road for their uncle to become Richard III. So he does. Then Richard sends the boys to the Tower of London. That's when they disappear. Even though the 2 young princes are declared illegitimate, they're technically not a threat anymore. Richard knows that they're always going to be a threat because they had been legitimate their whole lives, and their dad was very successful and very popular. So they are a threat. They continue to be a threat, but it wouldn't make sense for him to execute them right away. If he was going to execute them at all, it wouldn't make sense to execute them right away. It would be really bad PR. So they are in the tower. And according to one of the sources around that time, they are said to have been seen playing, and then seen playing, and then seen less, and disappeared. So this happens over time. And it's kind of reminiscent of Arthur Plantagenet in that they were there, they were in captivity, and then they disappeared. I think it's also kind of reminiscent of Arthur Plantagenet in that Richard III never expected to be king while his brother was alive because his brother was king, and then there were 2 more kids in line. And if Edward had survived to adulthood, if the boys had been older, then Richard III would have had no opportunity to be king. So it's almost, again, a little bit like Macbeth, perhaps more than Shakespeare's Richard III, to see that crown being very far from you and then all of a sudden being very close to you. This is not me saying Richard III, for a fact, kill these boys, but I just think it's interesting psychologically to see the parallels between John and Richard, and also to see what it would be like, or to think about what it would be like to be Richard III and to see what's happening that's actually getting the crown much closer to you. Either way, the boys disappear, and Richard never does produce them to be seen again. Then Richard III is killed at the Battle of Bosworth. He is replaced by Henry Tudor. So Henry VII, he's the first Tudor. He marries Elizabeth of York, who was one of Edward IV's daughters, and unites the 2 rival houses, ending the Wars of the Roses. But this isn't the end of the story, of course, because we're talking about power. So Henry comes to the throne through the Lancastrian line. So people who are still upset about the Wars of the Roses don't really feel like they're ended with the marriage to Elizabeth of York. People still would rather have seen the son of Edward IV on the throne. And so a couple of rebellions brew on the continent. The first one was led by a boy who was later said to be, at least by the Tudors, said to be Lambert Simnel. And his rebellion was unsuccessful. It was backed by continental powers, but it was unsuccessful. And Henry Tudor did not execute Lambert Simnel, but apparently kept him as a worker in the kitchens. He's just a boy. And obviously, Henry didn't find him a threat. So Lambert Simnel is not executed. Was he somebody else, just a pretender? I don't know. I will leave that up to you. You can watch the new documentary and figure that out. But the traditional story is that this is Lambert Simnel. He's called Lambert Simnel, and he is unsuccessful at taking the throne from Henry Tudor. The second rebellion was in the name of Richard, the second prince in the Tower, the younger prince in the Tower. And it was led by somebody who was later revealed to be, or said to be, somebody called Perkin Warbeck. And Henry also did not execute Perkin Warbeck, at least not right away. When Perkin Warbeck escaped, then Henry had him captured and had him executed for treason. People will point to the fact that Perkin Warbeck was not executed as a traitor in that he was not hanged, drawn, and quartered, which is something that happened to Hugh Despenser back further in the day. But he was just hanged. And we have to remember that it would look pretty bad for Henry Tudor to have drawn and quartered somebody who continental people had said was Richard, Duke of York. It just would have been bad optics. So just having him hanged did the trick. It got rid of Henry's problem, and it didn't exacerbate the situation. So those were the two pretenders. And if we come to the documentary that's just come out and the book that's just come out by Philippa Langley and a few other people, their theory is that the two princes in the tower, Edward and Richard, escaped from the tower, went to the continent, and they were the ones that actually stirred up rebellion. This is not the account that other people have written down at the time. They said that the first rebellion was not in the name of Edward, son of Edward IV, but actually Edward, Earl of Warwick. So this is actually confused, and people are going to have to disentangle it. Better minds than me are going to have to disentangle it based on the evidence that they have. They also say in the new documentary that Perkin Warbeck was actually Richard, Duke of York, and that he died under the name of Perkin Warbeck. So this is what people are saying, and they have evidence. I don't want to spoil anything for people, so you can have a look at that. So there are a lot of people in this documentary, people who I have a huge amount of respect for, and I'm just going to drop their names in case you want to find out more about this, about the case, what's going on with it. So Philippa Langley is the person who spearheaded the effort, but there's a huge amount of people who are looking for more evidence of the princes in the tower surviving. Matt Lewis is somebody who believes that they survived. He's also in this documentary. He's written about it. And if you want to know more about this particular new evidence, you can go to his History Hit podcast, Gone Medieval. He and my friend Eleanor Yanniga are the two hosts of that show, so you can listen to Matt Lewis talking about that. One of the other people that appears in the documentary is Nathan Amin, and I really want to make sure that he gets his 15 minutes because he's on the other side. He is a Tudor historian, and he believes that the pretenders were actually pretenders. So I think if you want a balanced perspective, there are a lot of good voices in this documentary to check out. One of the pieces of evidence that people point to when it comes to the princes in the tower is that there were bones found there in the 17th century. They are said to be the bones of two boys, and they were interred in Westminster Abbey as if they were the princes in the tower. They have never been tested for DNA. Queen Elizabeth II was petitioned to test them for DNA, but she decided not to. Who knows if King Charles is going to test them for DNA? I think that this is going to be pretty much the only thing that is going to settle this as much as it's probably going to be settled. Nathan Amin, who I just mentioned, said on Twitter today, and you can tell that if I'm saying today, if you look at his date stamp, that I'm really just seeing this documentary and recording this podcast, that he's hoping that the bones are tested because maybe that will at least rule one of the things out and maybe we won't hear about the princes in the tower anymore. And I totally get that perspective because this is one mystery that's just never going to be put to rest. I will tell you that I did watch the documentary this morning, although I haven't read Philippa Langley's book. And while I think it makes really great TV and that they found some really super interesting documents, and I think it's worth watching this documentary just for that. Some of the things that were discovered are super interesting. I'm not convinced that the princes survived. I think if we base this on probability, again, and people are going to come after me, but don't at me. This is just what I think. And I haven't looked into it super deeply, but I think the boys died in the tower. That is my personal opinion. Did Richard have anything to do with it personally or on his orders? I don't know. And it doesn't really matter to me. But I don't, at this point, from what I have seen, I don't think that they survived. I think it's most likely that they died in the tower, just like Arthur Plantagenet died, most likely at the hands of his uncle. So did Richard III kill his nephews? I don't know. I don't know any more than I did this morning, but I did see some pretty cool documents in this documentary. So this brings me to some thinking about historical mysteries. First of all, anytime someone disappears in the Middle Ages, there is scope for conjecture and for trying to figure out what happened to them, whether what happened to them was totally pedestrian or spectacular. And if you don't believe me, there is a whole book called Who Murdered Chaucer, which came out about, probably 20 years ago. Terry Jones spearheaded that effort, along with Robert Yeager, Terry Dolan, Alan Fletcher, and Juliette Dorr. And this is a whole book about possible reasons for Chaucer to have disappeared around 1400. As you know, with Richard II being deposed, this is a pretty tumultuous time, and these authors have a theory as to who murdered Chaucer. So when you have a disappearance, there's always scope for crazy things to happen, whether they are true or false. And again, if we're looking at things where people have rumors or there are pretenders, remember that there was a small case of that became really famous, which was the return of Martin Guerre. And if you haven't looked into that mystery, I definitely think you should. It's a very, very interesting one. And that work was done by Natalie Zeman Davis. And this is a good opportunity to say that I hope that you had a chance to listen to my podcast with Natalie Zeman Davis. We just lost her very recently, and she was just an extremely warm and kind and extremely sharp person. And I mean that in the best way. Intellectually, she was just unmatched. And so I hope that, Natalie, wherever you are, that you are resting in peace. I was so happy to meet you. And I hope that everyone interested in medieval studies and medieval mysteries checks out The Return of Martin Guerre. People are always going to be questioning things. And this is a wonderful thing about humanity. We are curious and we want to know and we love a good mystery. So I think personally, we will never know. We will never ever know if Richard III killed his nephews. We could find a document signed in Richard's own blood that we could DNA test and say that this matches the body of the skeleton that's just been interred. And it says, I did it. I killed Prince Edward and Prince Richard. And it still would not put this case to bed. So maybe Nathan Amin is right. We just need to forget that these princes ever existed. But it's not going to happen. People love a good mystery. The other tricky thing is for anyone to ever believe something from the Middle Ages, what we pretty much only have is documentary evidence. And the perfect documentary evidence has to be an eyewitness who is completely credible, like has no political agenda that anyone could possibly speculate about. They have to have written things down, like basically the second it happened, and that document has to have survived. And when you think about these criteria, it's very hard to meet them to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt. I think some people may find that frustrating, that we don't have a conclusion that is solid, that is beyond a reasonable doubt, but that is just history. It's just the way it is. And so while I don't think the case is closed on Richard III and the Princes of the Tower, and I think it will never be closed, I definitely think it's interesting to look into it. And it's a great reason to be looking through archives for more evidence, because the stuff that you can discover, whether it's intentional or unintentional, is just really valuable and interesting. And I mean, people are talking about history again, which is always a good thing, no matter what side of the camp you end up falling on, or whether you have no skin in the game at all. So I hope you found this an interesting episode. Disappearing royals, the pretenders that come after them, the rumors that swirl around after them. I think it's just interesting to look at these stories every once in a while and think about the many ways things could have gone and the many different motives that people have. It's just like a good murder mystery that you could get from Agatha Christie. But the thing is, it's actually something that happened. So I hope you like this episode. And if you're interested in learning more, those are some books that you can read to learn more. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. Well, I've been working on a couple of pieces that will be out by the time this podcast comes out. And I think they're both pretty interesting. The first one is on the Black Death, something we talk about quite a lot on medievalist.net. But I wanted to look at what were the estimates for how many people died in Europe, because those estimates range in the tens of millions to, even far more than that. How many people died? There's all sorts of numbers that get thrown around. So I wanted to explain what were the different evaluations that have been done by historians, and even ones that have just been done in the last couple of years, and what they mean and what they say about it.
That's a good idea because I think that there are all sorts of numbers out there, as you say, and it's good to know where the estimates are coming from.
Yeah, so we got that, and we have a piece on medieval insults.
Nice.
The medieval people really were pretty good at insulting each other at war, at peace, at banquets, and out on the street. We have all these cases, so many in Italy, even in England as well, where people are hurling verbal abuse at each other.
It's a tale as old as time. So where did you gather these insults from? Where are you getting them from?
There's resources we have thrown out by scholars like Trevor Dean, looking at city authorities and how they kind of crack down. There are a lot of laws, municipal laws against insults because of the idea it brings shame, dishonor. So these were things that were cracked down upon by local authorities. And sometimes they were the targets of this verbal abuse too. So these are all spread out over cities, and there's a few chronicles that mention it as well.
All right. So if people need to reload on their insults, this is the place to go.
Yes. None of these insults are family friendly, by the way. They're really terrible at talking to each other.
Okay. Then people are going to have to read it instead of listening to it.
Yes. You can read it, but you're a family friendly show, right?
Yeah. Yeah. For the most part. I think we are a mature family friendly. Yes. But let's keep the insults to medievalist.net for people to read. Well, thank you for compiling those insults and for stopping by to tell us about them.
Thanks.
Thank you to each and every one of you who supports this podcast and other indie historians through medievalist.net's Patreon page. As you know, patrons have access to all sorts of awesome stuff like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, a book club, and ad-free versions of medievalist.net and this podcast. Without your patronage, the Medieval Podcast wouldn't exist, so thank you. To get in on all the action, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from mysteries to histories, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and soon to be audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening and have yourself an amazing day.